The story of Prince Harry's grand return begins not with fanfare, but with silence. The kind of silence that clings to the walls of Buckingham Palace and echoes across the cobblestones of the Mall, where tourists gather with cameras in hand, always expecting a spectacle. For months, rumors had swirled of an inevitable confrontation, whispers of broken promises, and speculation about where Harry truly stood in the grand chessboard of monarchy and betrayal. But what unfolded surpassed even the most dramatic tabloid headline. Harry returned not as a rebel prince clinging to the fringes of Hollywood glamour, but as a son and a brother stepping into the fire, willing to speak truths that for years had been buried under layers of secrecy, denial, and performance. His return was not about nostalgia for the family he once knew, it was about loyalty, and perhaps even redemption. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The first sighting of Harry was carefully orchestrated, yet raw in its impact. He appeared solemn, shoulders squared, no longer flanked by Meghan's meticulously curated presence. He stood alone, every movement studied by cameras, every glance magnified into symbolism. The absence of Meghan was louder than any statement he could have made, yet it was his words that would send shockwaves through the monarchy and the public alike. He spoke of loyalty to his brother William and his sister-in-law Catherine, newly crowned queen, with a sincerity that seemed almost unrecognizable compared to the defiance that had once characterized his public image. This was not the defiant young man walking away from duty in exchange for freedom. This was a man who had been tested, who had seen the cost of deception up close, and who had decided that truth was heavier than illusion. What gave his return its dramatic weight was not simply the act of showing up, it was the confession that followed. For years, speculation about Meghan's true intentions had filled tabloids and gossip columns. The notion that she had been working behind the scenes to secure Hollywood contracts while still presenting herself as a working royal was dismissed as conspiracy by some, but fiercely believed by others. Now, Harry himself confirmed it. He revealed that long before they had publicly announced their departure from royal duties, Meghan had already been inking deals with producers, publishers, and executives. Hollywood's red carpets and publishing houses had been waiting, not because Meghan was a free agent, but because she had quietly positioned herself while still wearing the crown's borrowed legitimacy. The betrayal was not simply personal, it was institutional. She had deceived not just Harry, but the entire monarchy, and by extension, the public who had once embraced her as a royal bride of change and promise. The revelation hit like thunder rolling across the skies above London. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Meghan's story of victimhood, of being suffocated by an unyielding institution, was cast in a different light. If she had been negotiating contracts while still attending royal engagements and pledging commitment to the Queen, then the question wasn't about whether the palace had failed her. The question became, had she ever intended to remain part of the royal family at all? For Harry, this wasn't just a matter of marital betrayal, it was a public humiliation, a realization that while he defended her against his own blood, she had already been constructing a life outside those gilded walls. The drama was Shakespearean in its scope. Love clashing with duty, trust unraveling into betrayal, and a man torn between the woman he loved and the family he had been born to serve. The introduction of Catherine into this story is not merely ceremonial. For Harry to vow loyalty to her as queen carried a weight that went beyond personal affection. Catherine, long regarded as steady, measured, and unwavering in her dedication to the institution, became the new symbol of monarchy's endurance. In her, the public saw dignity and quiet strength, the antithesis of Meghan's performative Hollywood shine. By aligning himself with Catherine and William, Harry was making more than a familial statement. He was making a public declaration that he recognized where true duty lay, and he was willing to stand alongside the very people his wife had once framed as oppressors. For William, this was no small victory. For years, the brothers had been divided by bitterness, with Harry accusing William of cruelty, coldness, and a refusal to embrace Meghan. Now, in a dramatic twist, Harry acknowledged that William had been right all along, that the deception had been there from the beginning, hidden beneath Meghan's polished smiles and carefully rehearsed speeches. The emotional intensity of Harry's confession cannot be overstated. He did not simply accuse Meghan of deception, he admitted his own blindness. He acknowledged that he had been swept into a narrative that promised freedom but delivered disillusionment. He admitted that his loyalty to Meghan had once clouded his ability to see her true intentions. And in doing so, he laid bare a truth that millions had whispered for years, that Meghan's rise was not about service or love, but about opportunity. She had played the role of royal bride while secretly scripting her Hollywood comeback. For Harry, the pain of admitting this was visible, yet it was also liberating. In exposing her, he was also freeing himself from the chains of secrecy that had bound him for years. But this was not just a family scandal, it was a national reckoning. The British monarchy has survived wars, abdications, divorces, and scandals. Yet the idea that a royal bride had exploited her position to advance her career while betraying the trust of the crown struck at the heart of what the monarchy represents. Loyalty, service, and sacrifice are the pillars upon which the institution rests. Meghan's actions, as confessed by Harry, represented the opposite: ambition, self-interest, and deception. The contrast between Meghan and Catherine could not have been sharper. One symbolized endurance and service, the other opportunism and disloyalty. And in Harry's return, the monarchy gained not only a prodigal son but also a weapon of truth against the narrative Meghan had so carefully built. As the cameras rolled and Harry's words were broadcast to millions, the story became more than just gossip, it became a question of legacy. What does it mean for the monarchy that one of its own publicly exposes betrayal from within? What does it mean for Harry's children, whose mother now stood accused of deceiving both their father and their royal lineage? And what does it mean for the future of William and Catherine's reign, now supported by the brother who once threatened to dismantle it? The answers were not immediate, but the questions lingered in every headline, every editorial, and every living room conversation. The introduction of this story closes not with resolution, but with tension. The audience is left on the edge of their seats, torn between shock at Meghan's alleged deception and curiosity about what comes next. Will Harry's confession mend the fractured bond with his family, or will it deepen the wounds between him and Meghan? Will the monarchy emerge stronger, or will the exposure of such betrayal further erode its standing in a world already skeptical of its relevance? These are the questions that drive the story forward, questions that ensure viewers will not only stay until the end but also carry the weight of this revelation long after the screen goes dark. For in the tale of Harry's grand return, there is no simple ending, only the beginning of a new chapter in a saga that continues to capture the imagination of millions around the world. Harry's return to the royal fold was not a quiet re-entry, it was an event heavy with symbolism, emotion, and history. To understand the magnitude of that moment, one must first picture the atmosphere, the streets of London buzzing with anticipation, reporters lined up outside the palace gates, and citizens craning their necks in the hope of catching a glimpse of the prince who had once walked away. There was no mistaking it. This was not just about a family reunion, this was about the monarchy itself facing a reckoning. The return of Prince Harry was both a personal act of redemption and a political moment that signaled a new alignment within the crown. The emotional homecoming began with Harry's appearance at a public engagement that seemed carefully chosen to send a message of unity and tradition. No Hollywood-style entrances, no glitzy red carpet flair, just Harry walking into a setting that symbolized continuity, a church service attended by senior royals and public figures. The choice of venue was deliberate, it reminded people that Harry was still tied to centuries of history, no matter how far he had strayed. Cameras captured the rawness of his face, stripped of the California polish that had once defined his appearances with Meghan. He looked older, wiser, and noticeably burdened by the weight of his confession. This was not the same Harry who had thrown accusations at his family from across the Atlantic. This was a Harry humbled, yet resolute, ready to embrace his place in the institution he had once abandoned. Observers noted the subtle but telling details. His posture was straighter than usual, his tone subdued but clear, his eyes frequently glancing toward William and Catherine. It was as if he were signaling, not just to the family but to the nation, that his allegiance had shifted, that his loyalty was being redirected where it belonged. For years, Harry had been cast as the spare, the restless brother overshadowed by William's destiny as heir. But now, he wasn't seeking to compete or rebel, He was standing in acknowledgement of William's role, and of Catherine's emergence as a central figure in the monarchy. The moment Harry declared his loyalty was one that resonated deeply with both the public and the palace. His words were simple, yet powerful. He spoke of family, of duty, and of service, words that once seemed foreign to his Californian narrative of independence and self-discovery. He addressed William not as a rival, but as a brother who had carried the burden of responsibility with dignity. He acknowledged Catherine as queen, a title that carried centuries of weight, and vowed to stand by her side as she navigated her new role. To those listening, it was not just a personal statement, it was a declaration of allegiance to the monarchy itself. The symbolism was profound. For years, Meghan and Harry had portrayed themselves as outsiders forced into exile by a cold, unyielding institution. But here was Harry himself, willingly stepping back into that very institution, aligning with the figures Meghan had most directly opposed. In that one moment, he dismantled years of narrative that had been spun about oppression and victimhood. He showed that the monarchy, though imperfect, remained his home, his foundation, and his future. The applause that followed his statement wasn't just polite, it was thunderous, echoing the public's hunger for reconciliation, for strength, and for truth. Behind the public spectacle, however, there was a private reckoning. The homecoming wasn't just about cameras and statements, it was about the deeply personal act of re-entering a family that had been fractured by years of accusations and resentment. William's expression was a mixture of caution and relief, a man who had always wished for his brother's return but who had been burned too many times before to trust easily. Catherine's response was more measured, but equally symbolic. Her gentle nod during Harry's declaration signaled acceptance, a small gesture that carried immense significance. She had long been a stabilizing force within the family, and now Harry's loyalty placed her squarely at the center of the monarchy's renewal. The British people understood the weight of that moment. In Harry's return, they saw not just a prince reclaiming his place, but a reflection of their own values of forgiveness and resilience. Britain has always prided itself on tradition, endurance, and the ability to weather storms. Harry's homecoming mirrored those traits. He had made mistakes, he had strayed, but now he was standing before the nation, admitting his wrongs and pledging to do better. That act of humility resonated deeply with a country that values accountability, even among its royals. Of course, the return wasn't without its skeptics. Critics questioned whether Harry's newfound loyalty was genuine or simply a calculated move in light of Meghan's exposure. Some wondered if his confession about Meghan's secret deals was less about truth and more about self-preservation. Could he truly be trusted after years of lashing out against the very family he now praised? These questions hung in the air, adding complexity to the narrative. But even among doubters, there was a recognition that the act of returning, of aligning with William and Catherine, was no small gesture. It represented a shift that could not be dismissed. The emotional intensity of the homecoming extended beyond the palace walls. Ordinary citizens across the country debated the significance of Harry's return in pubs, offices, and family kitchens. For many, it was a sign of hope that the monarchy could heal its divisions and move forward stronger. For others, it was a bittersweet reminder of the damage done, of the years lost to bitterness and estrangement. The generational divide was evident. Older Britons, who valued duty and tradition above all, welcomed Harry's return as a restoration of order. Younger voices, more critical of the monarchy as a whole, saw it as a strategic move rather than a heartfelt one. But whether embraced or questioned, Harry's return commanded attention, and that was its own kind of victory. For Harry himself, the homecoming was more than a public performance, it was a personal catharsis. He had been living a life split between two worlds, the duty he had been born into, and the freedom he thought he wanted. Now, with Meghan's deception laid bare, the clarity was undeniable. His place was not in Hollywood, chasing fleeting relevance, but in the centuries-old institution that had shaped him, for better or worse. He had tried to outrun his royal destiny, only to find that it was inescapable, etched into his very being. And so, his return was not just about loyalty to William and Catherine, it was about acceptance of himself, of who he truly was and always would be. As the day of his homecoming drew to a close, the image that remained was powerful: Harry standing shoulder to shoulder with William and Catherine, a trinity that represented the monarchy's past, present, and future. The crowd's cheers, the flash of cameras, the quiet nods exchanged between siblings. All of it painted a picture of renewal. Yet beneath the surface, the real work was only beginning. Trust had to be rebuilt, wounds had to be healed, and the monarchy had to navigate the fallout of Meghan's betrayal. But in that moment, there was unity. And for a family and an institution long defined by division, that unity was nothing short of historic. The emotional homecoming was not the end of Harry's journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter. By declaring his loyalty and exposing the truth, he had set in motion a series of events that would reshape not only his own life but the future of the monarchy itself. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Harry was walking it with his family by his side. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful statement of all. When Harry stood before the nation and vowed loyalty to William and Catherine, it was not merely the recitation of prepared words, it was a public act of transformation. For years, his identity had been tangled in conflict, between duty and freedom, between family and individuality, between tradition and modernity. Now, in aligning himself with the new king and queen, he was casting aside ambiguity and placing himself firmly on the side of continuity. To grasp the significance of that moment, one has to look beyond the simple declaration of loyalty and examine the deeper layers of what it meant for Harry, for William and Catherine, and for the monarchy as a whole. The vow itself came during a gathering meant to symbolize unity. The venue was traditional, a reminder of history's weight, but the mood was modern, charged with the awareness that the monarchy was evolving before the public eye. Harry did not speak with the fiery tone of defiance that had characterized his interviews in California. His voice was steady, calm, almost reverent, as he acknowledged William's rightful place as king and Catherine's ascent as queen. He called them not just leaders but anchors, figures who embodied service and stability in a world where so little felt certain. To many listeners, this was the clearest break yet between Harry and the life he had built with Meghan, a life centered on grievance, independence, and narrative control. The words that struck the deepest chord were those in which Harry admitted his errors. He confessed that for too long he had resisted William's guidance, mistaking firmness for coldness. He admitted that he had misjudged Catherine, dismissing her quiet composure as detachment when in truth it was strength. And in admitting these things, he humanized himself. The public had seen Harry lash out, seen him cast blame, but rarely had they seen him humble himself in this way. The vow of loyalty was not just about the future, it was about acknowledging the past and asking for forgiveness, both from his family and from the people who had once seen him as a favorite son of the monarchy. William's reaction was measured, his face revealing little, but the significance was clear. For years, he had been forced to shoulder the monarchy's burdens while also managing the fallout from his brother's rebellion. To hear Harry speak words of loyalty must have been both vindicating and complicated. Vindicating, because William's warnings about Meghan's ambitions had been confirmed. Complicated, because forgiveness does not erase years of pain. Catherine, on the other hand, responded with the grace that had defined her role from the beginning. A slight nod, a glance toward Harry, a soft but visible smile, all subtle gestures that spoke volumes. She did not need to make grand statements. Her acceptance of his loyalty was quiet, dignified, and powerful in its restraint. For the monarchy, Harry's vow carried strategic weight. Public perception of the crown has always hinged on the image of unity. The spectacle of two brothers divided, with one siding against the institution, had been one of the greatest threats to its stability in recent years. Now, with Harry returning to the fold and openly supporting William and Catherine, that threat was weakened. The institution could now present itself as cohesive, weathering scandal and betrayal but ultimately stronger for it. The vow was more than words, it was a recalibration of public confidence. For every critic who saw the monarchy as outdated, there were millions who found reassurance in the sight of reconciliation and loyalty.
In the end, Harry's redemption arc was not a story of triumph, but of perseverance. It was about a man who had lost his way, who had been blinded by love and ambition, but who found the courage to admit his mistakes and seek forgiveness. It was about rebuilding bonds with the brother who had always protected him, the sister-in-law who had endured his silence, and the father who had struggled to connect with him. It was about proving to the public that he was more than the sum of his scandals. And it was about showing the world that redemption is not about erasing the past, but about living differently in the present. Harry's redemption was, in the end, a reminder of something deeply human, that even in the glare of global scrutiny, even under the weight of history and tradition, families can fracture and heal, trust can be broken and rebuilt, and people can change. For Britain, that message mattered as much as the monarchy itself. The task of repairing bonds with William and Catherine was perhaps the most delicate and significant part of Harry's redemption arc. Publicly pledging loyalty to them was one thing. Rebuilding the trust that had been broken in private was quite another. The relationship between the three had once been close, even familial in its warmth. Catherine had been like a sister to Harry, William his protector and confidant. That bond had been fractured not only by Meghan's presence, but by Harry's own choices, accusations, interviews, and a memoir that laid bare grievances against his family. For William and Catherine, those wounds ran deep. Harry's confession of Meghan's duplicity opened the door to reconciliation, but walking through it required more than symbolic gestures. It demanded consistent humility, patience, and proof that he had changed. The first private meeting between Harry and William after the confession was tense. Accounts from insiders suggested that it took place in one of the quieter rooms of Windsor, far from the ears of staff or the glare of cameras. There was no embrace, no easy return to familiarity. William listened more than he spoke, his expression measured, his posture stiff. Harry spoke with urgency, apologizing for the accusations he had made, admitting he had been blind, and acknowledging that William had been right about Meghan all along. William's response was not anger, but silence. He had learned over the years that silence carried more weight than words, and in that silence Harry understood how deep the wound went. Trust could not be rebuilt in one conversation. In the weeks that followed, Harry made a deliberate effort to show deference to William's position. At public engagements, he stood slightly behind his brother, careful not to overshadow him. He addressed him as king in formal settings, resisting the temptation to slip into the familiarity of wills. Privately, however, he tried to bridge the gap with reminders of their shared past. He spoke of their mother, of the nights they had comforted each other after her death, of the bond that had once been unbreakable. These memories softened William's stance, if only slightly. For a man who valued loyalty above all else, the reminder of their shared grief struck a chord. Catherine's reaction was equally important. She had endured years of unfair criticism, much of it fueled by Meghan and, indirectly, Harry. For Harry to seek her forgiveness required not only words, but actions. He began by acknowledging her sacrifices. In private meetings, he told her that he now understood the strength it had taken for her to remain dignified under attack. He admitted that he had been wrong to misjudge her quietness as coldness. He praised her for her endurance and acknowledged her as the steady heart of the monarchy. Catherine, ever composed, did not indulge in reproach. Her response was gracious, but it was clear that forgiveness would not come cheaply. She accepted his words, but waited to see whether his actions would match them. Behind closed doors, the process of rebuilding trust took the form of small, consistent gestures. Harry began spending more time in Britain, not only for public events, but for private family gatherings. He attended informal dinners with William and Catherine, where conversation shifted cautiously from duty to family. He reconnected with his nephews and niece, playing with George, Charlotte, and Louis in ways that reminded everyone of the affectionate uncle he had once been. For Catherine, watching her children bond again with their uncle was a quiet reassurance. It showed that while the past could not be erased, the future could still be rebuilt. William, however, remained cautious. He set boundaries that were clear and firm. Harry would not be involved in certain sensitive discussions about the crown's future until he had proven his reliability over time. He would be welcome at family gatherings, but would need to rebuild his role in royal duties gradually. William made it clear that loyalty to the crown was not a performance, but a lifelong commitment. Harry accepted these boundaries without protest, recognizing that his brother's caution was justified. Each acceptance was another step in proving that his confession had been sincere. The dynamic between the three shifted slowly. At first, their interactions were formal, almost businesslike, but as weeks turned into months, glimpses of their old bond began to reappear. During one private charity event, William was overheard joking with Harry in a way that recalled their younger days. Catherine, too, was seen laughing with Harry over a light-hearted remark. These moments, though small, were significant. They showed that while the relationship was not what it once had been, warmth was beginning to seep back through the cracks. The public also noticed this shift. Photographs of Harry walking alongside William and Catherine at engagements were scrutinized for signs of tension or ease. When Harry was seen leaning toward Catherine during a conversation, with her responding with a faint smile, newspapers reported it as evidence of thawing relations. When William placed a hand briefly on Harry's shoulder after a speech, the image was splashed across front pages as proof that reconciliation was possible. The monarchy understood the value of these images, allowing the public to see not just words but actions that hinted at healing. Catherine's influence during this period was profound. She acted as a mediator, softening William's harder edges and encouraging Harry's humility. She reminded both brothers of their mother's wishes, of the need for unity in the face of public scrutiny. Her presence made reconciliation possible, not by forcing it, but by creating a space where it could grow naturally. Harry recognized this and often spoke of her as the anchor holding the family together. In aligning himself with Catherine, he not only repaired his relationship with her, but also reinforced his loyalty to William through her influence. The process of repairing bonds was not without setbacks. There were moments of tension, particularly when old wounds resurfaced. William reportedly struggled with lingering anger over Harry's memoir, which had revealed private details of their conflicts. Catherine occasionally found herself hesitant, remembering the pain of being publicly criticized by Meghan with Harry's tacit approval. Yet each time tension arose, Harry responded with patience rather than defensiveness. He did not try to excuse his past actions, but acknowledged them and expressed regret. This consistent humility began to chip away at the walls his family had built around themselves. By the time several months had passed, the bond between Harry, William, and Catherine had transformed. It was no longer the carefree closeness of their younger years, nor the bitter estrangement of recent ones. It was something new, a cautious but growing trust built on honesty, humility, and shared duty. They would never erase the past, but they were learning to live beyond it. For Harry, this was redemption in its purest form, not being absolved entirely, but being given the chance to prove himself anew. The significance of repairing these bonds extended beyond the family. For the monarchy, unity between the brothers and Catherine was essential for public confidence. Images of reconciliation reassured the nation that the crown remained strong despite betrayal. For the public, watching Harry humble himself and slowly regain his place was a reminder that even the most fractured relationships could heal. And for Harry, repairing these bonds meant reclaiming the family that had defined his life, a family he had nearly lost forever. In the end, the process of rebuilding trust with William and Catherine was not a single event, but a journey. It was marked by apologies, boundaries, small gestures, and quiet moments behind closed doors. It was shaped by Catherine's grace, William's caution, and Harry's humility. And though it remained fragile, it was real. Harry had once walked away from his family. Now he was walking back, step by step, into their trust. The path forward for Harry under William and Catherine's reign was not straightforward, nor was it defined overnight. His confession and pledge of loyalty had reopened the door to the monarchy, but the way back in required careful navigation. Harry could not simply return to the role he once had, nor could he act as though the years of division had not happened. The crown does not forget, and neither do the people. What Harry could do was redefine his purpose within a monarchy now led by his brother and sister-in-law, positioning himself not as a rival or an outsider, but as a supporter, a servant of the institution, and a man seeking redemption through service. At first, Harry's role was intentionally limited. William and Catherine, cautious about public perception, understood that thrusting him too quickly into the spotlight could backfire. The wounds of the past were still fresh, and the monarchy had to show that Harry was rebuilding trust gradually, not reclaiming privileges simply because he had confessed. For this reason, Harry was included in select engagements, one symbolic enough to be noticed, but safe enough not to overshadow the king and queen. Charitable visits, military commemorations, and veterans' gatherings became his focus. These were causes close to his heart, areas where he had always excelled, and where his authenticity was undeniable. By leaning into these strengths, Harry began to craft a role that emphasized service rather than status. His first major appearance under William and Catherine's reign was at a remembrance ceremony honoring fallen soldiers. The symbolism was powerful. Harry, once a soldier himself, stood quietly beside William, his medals pinned neatly to his chest. Cameras captured the solemnity on his face, the way he bowed his head during moments of silence, the way he refrained from drawing attention to himself. Commentators noted the humility in his demeanor. He was no longer the prince trying to break free, but a man visibly content to stand in support of his brother and his queen. For veterans and serving soldiers in attendance, Harry's presence meant something. They remembered him not as a royal, but as one of their own, a man who had served alongside them in Afghanistan. His participation at such events allowed the public to see him through the lens of shared sacrifice rather than scandal. William's strategy for integrating Harry back into royal life was deliberate. He allowed Harry to participate in causes where he could shine without undermining the monarchy structure. For example, Harry was encouraged to revive his involvement with mental health campaigns. This was an area where his openness about his struggles resonated with the public, and it provided him a platform to contribute meaningfully without controversy. Under Catherine's guidance, Harry also began working more closely with charities supporting children and families, often appearing at events alongside her. Their joint appearances sent a message of unity. Harry was not just reconciling with William, but with Catherine as well. Catherine's influence on Harry's path forward was subtle but profound. She reminded him, often through her example rather than words, that service was not about spectacle but consistency. Watching her balance motherhood, queenship, and duty with composure gave Harry a model to emulate. He understood that his path forward would require him to do less talking and more showing. Catherine's calm presence also reassured the public that Harry's return was being managed responsibly. If the Queen herself could accept him at her side, then perhaps the nation could too. The British people responded cautiously but positively to Harry's new role. At public events, he was greeted with polite applause rather than the adoration he once commanded, but even that was progress. The public had not forgotten the pain of his accusations, but they respected his willingness to start again from the ground up. Polls reflected this slow rehabilitation. Approval ratings that had plummeted during his years in California began to creep upward, particularly among older Britons who valued his humility. Younger generations remained divided, but even among them, Harry's sincerity was beginning to resonate. Behind palace walls, Harry's integration into William and Catherine's reign was managed like a delicate balancing act. Advisors worked to ensure that he had enough visibility to demonstrate his loyalty, but not so much that he distracted from the king and queen. William set clear boundaries. Harry would not participate in matters of state or succession. His role was supportive, not political. This distinction was crucial for maintaining stability. Harry accepted these boundaries without protest, recognizing that his return was not about reclaiming what he had lost, but about building something new. Part of Harry's redemption also involved repairing his image internationally. His ties to America, once his base of operations with Meghan, now became complicated. In Hollywood, Meghan's brand had weakened, and Harry's confession had cast doubt on their narrative. To counterbalance this, Harry began to shift his focus toward the Commonwealth. He attended events in countries like Canada and Australia, where his mother's legacy remained strong. His speeches there were careful and humble, emphasizing unity, service, and learning from mistakes. Slowly, he began to rebuild his reputation not as a celebrity, but as a prince who had stumbled and grown. William and Catherine supported this international repositioning. They understood that Harry could serve as an ambassador of sorts, strengthening ties within the Commonwealth without being central to the monarchy's constitutional duties. This role allowed him to contribute meaningfully while keeping him at arm's length from the core of power. It also reassured the public that his return was about service, not ambition. Perhaps the most significant change in Harry's role was his willingness to step into the background. In the past, he had often bristled at being the spare, overshadowed by William. Now, he seemed content to support rather than compete. At public engagements, he deferred to William and Catherine, letting them take the spotlight while he blended into the background. For the public, this humility was striking. It suggested that Harry had finally come to terms with his place, not as heir, not as rival, but as supporter. That acceptance was the cornerstone of his redemption. The path forward was not without its challenges. Meghan's absence loomed over Harry's new role, raising questions about the state of his marriage. Critics wondered whether his loyalty to William and Catherine could coexist with his life in California. Rumors circulated about strain between him and Meghan, with some suggesting that her silence on his confession was evidence of a deep rift. Harry, however, avoided these questions publicly. He focused on his duties, refusing to be drawn into speculation. For the monarchy, this silence was useful. It allowed them to present Harry as fully aligned with them, regardless of Meghan's choices. Over time, Harry's new role began to solidify. He was not the rebellious prince of old, nor the exiled figure of California. He was something different, a humbled man who had found purpose in service, a supporter of the monarchy under William and Catherine, and a reminder that redemption is possible even after betrayal. The British people, though cautious, began to accept him in this role. He was no longer the star of the show, but he did not need to be. His place was secure, not because of his title, but because of his willingness to stand in loyalty. For William and Catherine, Harry's presence became an asset. He symbolized the monarchy's ability to endure scandal, to forgive, and to move forward. His redemption reinforced their reign, projecting an image of unity and strength. For the public, his journey was a story of human frailty and resilience, one that mirrored their own struggles with family, trust, and forgiveness. And for Harry, the path forward was not about reclaiming what he had lost, but about embracing what he could still give. In the end, Harry's new role under William and Catherine's reign was defined not by power or privilege, but by humility, service, and loyalty. It was the role of a man who had stumbled, confessed, and chosen to walk a different path. It was the role of a brother who had found his way back, not to the center, but to the circle of family. And it was the role of a prince who had finally understood that his true legacy would not be in rebellion, but in redemption. Meghan's downfall after Harry's revelations was swift, brutal, and deeply isolating. For years, she had crafted a narrative of resilience and empowerment, presenting herself as the woman who stood against an ancient, unyielding institution and dared to speak her truth. She had been embraced by Hollywood, celebrated by progressive voices, and championed as a modernizer who challenged outdated traditions. But Harry's confession, that she had secretly signed Hollywood and publishing deals while still a working royal, shattered that narrative in an instant. What had once been framed as courage now looked like calculation. What had once been praised as honesty now appeared as duplicity. The carefully constructed image of Meghan Markle, the silenced Duchess turned global icon, began to crumble, leaving her exposed and increasingly alone. The first sign of her downfall came from the media. Outlets that had once defended her began to turn. Newspapers that had celebrated her as a disruptor now ran headlines questioning her integrity. American talk shows that had framed her as a victim of palace cruelty began to ask whether she had manipulated not only the monarchy, but also the public. Commentators pointed to the timing of her deals, the speed with which contracts were finalized after her departure, and the contradiction between her public claims of oppression and her private pursuit of multimillion-dollar opportunities. The story that Harry had laid bare was too stark to ignore, and it became the lens through which all of Meghan's past actions were re-examined. Hollywood, once her sanctuary, grew cold. Executives who had eagerly courted her for her royal cachet now worried about the taint of deception. Meghan's value as a brand was built on trust, on the idea that she was authentic, relatable, and brave enough to share her story. With Harry's revelations, that trust evaporated. Studios began quietly distancing themselves, delaying projects or scaling back promotion. Publishers, once eager for her voice, now debated whether her words would sell as they once had. Her brand had been built on the crown's prestige. Now, stripped of credibility, it was weakened in the very industry she had hoped would sustain her. For Meghan personally, the isolation was devastating. Harry's confession not only undermined her public image, but also left her without her most powerful defender. In California, she had often leaned on him to counter criticism, to speak of her struggles, and to validate her narrative. Now, that voice was gone, redirected toward loyalty to William and Catherine. Harry's silence on her behalf was louder than any condemnation. For Meghan, it meant that the partnership she had once relied on was fractured, if not broken. The man who had once stood as her shield was now standing with the family she had tried to redefine. Friends in Hollywood, once eager to associate with her, began to retreat. Invitations to glamorous events dwindled. Private dinners grew smaller, her name whispered with caution rather than excitement. Some allies tried to defend her, framing her deals as pragmatic and insisting that she had every right to secure her future. But the tide of public opinion was too strong, and defending Meghan began to look like defending dishonesty. Her isolation deepened not because she had no defenders, but because those defenders could no longer be heard above the roar of Harry's truth. The British public's judgment of Meghan was merciless. Many felt they had been deceived, manipulated into believing she was a victim while she had been pursuing wealth and fame all along. Older Britons, in particular, viewed her actions as proof that she had never respected the monarchy or the country. Middle-aged professionals saw in her duplicity a kind of entitlement that was offensive in its arrogance. Even younger generations, once her strongest supporters, grew divided. Some clung to her narrative, but many admitted they now felt betrayed. The sense of trust, once central to her appeal, had been shattered, and in Britain, betrayal of the monarchy is not easily forgiven. The contrast with Catherine became Meghan's undoing. Side-by-side comparisons dominated the media. Catherine at hospitals, schools, and charity events, exuding dignity and quiet strength. Meghan at premieres, in interviews, or described in negotiations with Hollywood executives. Harry's loyalty to Catherine reinforced this contrast, elevating Catherine as the embodiment of grace and Meghan as the symbol of ambition. The narrative wrote itself, and Meghan was cast in the role of the deceiver. The British people embraced Catherine all the more fiercely, and Meghan's image sank further into isolation. Her silence during the frenzy only made matters worse. In the past, Meghan had been quick to tell her side of the story, whether through interviews or public statements. This time, however, she said nothing. Her absence was interpreted as guilt, her silence as confirmation. The longer she remained quiet, the more the public filled in the gaps with their own conclusions. Was she strategizing her next move? Was she unable to defend herself because the truth was undeniable? Whatever the reason, her silence only deepened her isolation. Inside her marriage, the strain was palpable. Harry's loyalty to William and Catherine created a chasm that could not easily be bridged. Meghan, who had once enjoyed Harry's unwavering defense, now found herself without his protection. For Harry, reconciliation with his family was essential to his redemption. For Meghan, it was a betrayal. Their visions of the future had diverged, and the silence between them became as loud as any argument. While they remained legally bound, emotionally the distance grew. Meghan's isolation was no longer just public, it was personal. In America, her brand as a progressive icon also weakened. Activists and cultural commentators who had once championed her began to question whether her use of identity and struggle as part of her story had been genuine or opportunistic. The revelation that she had been negotiating deals while claiming to be silenced undermined the authenticity of her message. For an audience that values sincerity, this contradiction was damning. While some continued to defend her, the enthusiasm had waned. She was no longer the fresh, bold voice challenging tradition. She was a celebrity caught in the trap of her own duplicity. The isolation grew sharper as time passed. Without Harry by her side, Meghan's ability to command global attention diminished. Her projects, once announced with fanfare, struggled to gain traction. The media moved on from her as the main character of the royal drama, shifting focus to Harry's redemption and William and Catherine's reign. Meghan, once central to the narrative, became peripheral, a figure spoken of in the past tense rather than the present. For a woman who had built her life around visibility, this fading relevance was its own form of exile. Meghan's downfall was not simply a collapse of public image. It was the unraveling of a carefully constructed life. The deals she had signed became symbols of betrayal. The Hollywood network she had cultivated became a circle of whispers and distance. The public that had once celebrated her turned skeptical or outright hostile. The monarchy she had sought to challenge emerged stronger without her. And the husband who had once stood beside her now stood with the family she had opposed. By the end, Meghan's isolation was complete. She was no longer the duchess who promised to modernize the monarchy, nor the celebrity who promised to reshape Hollywood. She was a figure defined by betrayal, her legacy clouded by duplicity. The path forward for her was uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. The world she had built on ambition and deception had crumbled, leaving her alone in the silence of her own making. The monarchy has always been an institution of survival. Across centuries, it has weathered abdications, scandals, wars, divorces, and betrayals. Yet each time it has managed not only to endure, but to reframe itself as indispensable. Meghan's downfall, painful though it was in its exposure of duplicity, gave William and Catherine a rare opportunity, the chance to capitalize on the collapse of her narrative and use it to strengthen the crown, shaping a new era that presented them as the face of stability, dignity, and continuity. The monarchy, under their reign, seized this opportunity with a precision that revealed just how skilled the institution had become at turning crisis into renewal. The first step was control of the narrative. When Harry confessed Meghan's secret dealings, the palace did not need to issue dramatic statements or denounce her actions. Instead, they allowed silence, unity, and imagery to do the work. Photographs of William, Catherine, and Harry appearing together again circulated widely, each image reinforcing the message of reconciliation and resilience. The contrast was stark. Meghan was absent, isolated, and silent, while the monarchy appeared united and forward-looking. This visual storytelling was not accidental. Advisors ensured that the brothers were seen together at significant events, with Catherine positioned as the serene center between them. These carefully orchestrated appearances reminded the public that the monarchy could absorb betrayal and still project harmony. William and Catherine's reign leaned heavily on emphasizing service. Where Meghan had been accused of chasing fame and wealth, the king and queen positioned themselves as the embodiment of duty. Catherine's public engagements multiplied, each one reinforcing her image as compassionate, hands-on, and grounded. She was photographed in hospitals, schools, and community centers, connecting with ordinary people in ways that felt authentic and unforced. William, meanwhile, focused on leadership initiatives, climate action, mental health campaigns, and Commonwealth unity. Together, they presented themselves as a partnership of equals, modern yet traditional, glamorous yet relatable. In capitalizing on Meghan's fall, they highlighted the very qualities she lacked: consistency, humility, and a devotion to service over self. The monarchy also embraced Harry's redemption as part of its broader strategy. By publicly welcoming him back into the fold, William and Catherine transformed him from a liability into an asset. Harry's confession reinforced their strength. It showed that even a wayward prince recognized their legitimacy. His loyalty was used as a mirror, reflecting their worthiness to rule. At public events, Harry's presence sent a clear message that the family was united under the king and queen. His humility contrasted with Meghan's absence, amplifying the image of a monarchy that forgives, heals, and moves forward without bitterness. The crown's ability to absorb Harry's return while sidelining Meghan was a masterstroke of institutional resilience. Media coverage played directly into this strategy. British newspapers, once divided in their portrayal of Meghan, now rallied around William and Catherine. Headlines praised Catherine's quiet strength and William's steady leadership. Opinion pieces described their reign as a new Elizabethan era, evoking the memory of William's grandmother to emphasize continuity. Polls showed surging approval ratings for the couple, with Catherine in particular emerging as the most admired member of the family. By contrast, Meghan's image plummeted. her name associated with betrayal and ambition. The monarchy did not need to denounce her directly. The media, reflecting public sentiment, did it for them. Internationally, the monarchy leveraged Meghan's downfall to reassert its relevance. For years, critics in the United States and Commonwealth nations had accused the crown of cruelty, citing Meghan's complaints as evidence of an outdated institution. Harry's revelations flipped this narrative. Suddenly, it was Meghan who had deceived, and the monarchy that had been wronged. William and Catherine embarked on carefully planned tours, visiting Commonwealth nations where skepticism about the monarchy had grown. Their warm receptions, combined with Meghan's absence from the global stage, reinforced the image of a monarchy still capable of uniting people across cultures. The institution's survival no longer looked defensive, it looked triumphant. The monarchy also capitalized on the generational divide in public opinion. Younger Britons, once sympathetic to Meghan, were now more open to William and Catherine's model of leadership. Advisors understood that this was the time to highlight the couple's relatability. Images of them with their children, laughing at sporting events, or engaging with young people were released strategically. Social media campaigns emphasized their modernity without compromising tradition. The contrast with Meghan, who had embraced celebrity culture, could not have been clearer. William and Catherine appeared as the stable, relatable leaders of a monarchy that had learned to adapt. Behind palace walls, the fallout from Meghan's downfall was also used to strengthen institutional discipline. Lessons were drawn from her betrayal: stricter vetting of advisors and consorts, tighter controls on financial dealings, and renewed emphasis on loyalty as a non-negotiable value. These reforms were quiet, not publicized, but they ensured that no future outsider could exploit the crown as Meghan had. The monarchy, often criticized for being slow to adapt, had once again shown its ability to evolve in response to crisis. Catherine's role in this new era was particularly emphasized. She was framed not just as William's consort, but as a queen in her own right, a woman who had endured years of comparison and attack only to emerge stronger. Harry's loyalty to her was amplified in the narrative, reinforcing her image as the moral center of the family. The palace ensured that her visibility increased, allowing her to symbolize stability and grace at a time when Meghan's reputation was collapsing. By capitalizing on Meghan's failure, Catherine became the embodiment of what the monarchy wanted to project: resilience, dignity, and continuity. William's leadership was also sharpened by the contrast. Where Meghan had been portrayed as manipulative, William was shown as principled. Where Meghan had pursued deals, William pursued service. Where Meghan had fractured the family, William was shown as uniting it. His decision to welcome Harry back, while keeping boundaries firm, positioned him as a leader capable of forgiveness without naivety. The monarchy's strength was no longer just in its traditions but in the character of its leaders, and William embodied that strength. The British people's renewed loyalty was the monarchy's greatest victory. Street interviews revealed admiration for Catherine's endurance, respect for William's restraint, and cautious approval for Harry's humility. Meghan, once a symbol of hope for change, was now dismissed as a cautionary tale. The monarchy had outlasted her, just as it had outlasted so many before her. For the British public, this reinforced a timeless truth: individuals may falter, but the crown remains. Internationally, Meghan's isolation contrasted with the monarchy's resurgence. Hollywood's cooling interest in her projects made William and Catherine's tours all the more impactful. While Meghan struggled for relevance, the monarchy commanded it effortlessly. Even in America, where Meghan had once been embraced, opinions shifted. Polls showed declining sympathy for her and rising admiration for Catherine. The monarchy had turned Meghan's downfall into proof of its resilience. For Harry, this new era provided a path forward. His redemption was woven into the monarchy's strength, his loyalty used to amplify William and Catherine's legitimacy. For the public, his role as the humbled brother reinforced the image of a monarchy that could forgive without forgetting. The family was presented not as fractured, but as strengthened by reconciliation. The message was clear: the monarchy had survived the storm and emerged stronger. By the time the frenzy subsided, William and Catherine had solidified their reign as a new chapter for the monarchy. They had capitalized on Meghan's downfall not with vindictiveness, but with quiet dignity, allowing her duplicity to speak for itself. They had presented themselves as the embodiment of endurance, service, and unity, reminding the world that the crown's strength lies not in individuals, but in its ability to outlast them. Meghan's ambition had faltered. The monarchy's resilience had prevailed. The global press had always shaped how the monarchy was perceived outside Britain, and in the aftermath of Meghan's collapse, their role became decisive. For years, international media, especially in the United States, had amplified Meghan's narrative of victimhood, framing her as the bold outsider challenging the rigid traditions of an antiquated monarchy. Oprah's interview, Hollywood endorsements, and sympathetic editorials across Europe and America had cast the institution in a defensive light. Yet Harry's confession shifted the balance entirely. Suddenly, the monarchy was not the aggressor but the aggrieved, and Meghan was no longer the heroine of the story but the deceiver. The global press, always eager to adapt to a new narrative, quickly reframed its coverage. William and Catherine emerged as symbols of stability and continuity, while Meghan was increasingly portrayed as the architect of her own downfall. In Britain, the press needed little prompting. Newspapers that had once split between pro-Meghan and anti-Meghan stances united in declaring her duplicity. The Times and the Telegraph ran lengthy analyses about how her secret deals undermined the monarchy's trust. The Daily Mail and the Sun, never shy about their criticism, plastered front pages with headlines that branded her as opportunistic and disloyal. Even left-leaning outlets, which had once championed Meghan as a victim of institutional rigidity, now published cautious op-eds acknowledging the contradictions Harry's confession exposed. British media reframed the monarchy not as oppressive but as enduring, painting William and Catherine as the steady hands guiding the institution through turbulence. American media, however, was the true litmus test. For years, Meghan had found her strongest support across the Atlantic. Hollywood had celebrated her, American audiences had embraced her as a cultural figure, and talk shows had given her sympathetic platforms. Harry's confession disrupted this dynamic. Outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which had once written extensively about racism and cruelty within the monarchy, now turned their attention to Meghan's credibility. Investigative pieces scrutinized the timeline of her deals, pointing out that such negotiations could not have happened overnight. Magazines like Vanity Fair, once enamored with her as a modern duchess, ran reflective features asking whether Meghan's ambition had undone her. Morning shows began to invite critics alongside supporters, balancing their panels with voices who now questioned her authenticity. Hollywood trade papers, too, shifted their tone. Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, which had covered her ventures with excitement, began publishing cautious pieces about the risks of associating with Meghan. Executives, quoted anonymously, admitted concerns about the viability of her projects. They pointed out that while star power could sell, deception could sink credibility. The image of Meghan as a marketable brand weakened, and the industry, always pragmatic, began to distance itself. Where once she had been courted as a rare commodity, she was now treated with caution, her name less of an asset and more of a liability. In Europe, the press reflected both fascination and schadenfreude. French and German outlets, which had often been skeptical of Meghan's narrative, used Harry's confession to reinforce their doubts. Le Figaro described her as the actress who played Duchess and played it too well. Der Spiegel analyzed how her ambition clashed with the traditions of monarchy, concluding that she had underestimated the resilience of the institution. Spanish and Italian media, long enamored with royal scandals, framed the story as a modern fairy tale gone wrong. A duchess who tried to outshine the crown but instead destroyed her own standing. Across the continent, William and Catherine were cast as the dignified couple who had endured betrayal yet emerged stronger. The Commonwealth press offered another important perspective. In countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where Republican sentiment had grown in recent years, Meghan's narrative had once fueled calls for cutting ties with the monarchy. Harry's revelations complicated that. Suddenly, it was not the institution that appeared manipulative, but Meghan herself. In Canada, the Globe and Mail ran a feature titled "The Crown Endures: Lessons from Meghan's Fall." In Australia, commentators debated whether the monarchy's ability to survive such scandal proved its resilience. While Republican voices did not disappear, their arguments were muted by the reality that Meghan's credibility had been deeply damaged. Other members of the family reacted with varying degrees of shock and detachment. Eugenie, who had maintained a close bond with Harry even after his departure from royal duties, was said to be heartbroken for him. She offered quiet support, reminding him that love, not blood, defined parenthood. But her voice was drowned out by the larger chorus of condemnation. Andrew, already disgraced by his own scandals, had little to say, though privately he recognized that Harry's crisis shifted some of the public spotlight away from him. For the Queen's cousins and extended family, the revelation was yet another sign that the younger generation had failed to uphold the dignity of the crown. The middle of the family fallout was defined by frantic discussions behind palace doors. Advisors, aides, and courtiers convened to assess the damage. Could the monarchy survive if the truth became public? Should they attempt to discredit Harry, to frame him as unstable, to undermine the validity of the DNA test? Or should they accept the reality and attempt to reframe the narrative? The debates were fierce, the options limited. Every choice carried risk, and no path promised salvation. For Harry, the family fallout was both predictable and devastating. He had expected resistance, anger, and even betrayal. But experiencing it firsthand was a different matter. His father's fury, his brother's disappointment, his aunt's disdain, it all confirmed what he had long suspected, that the monarchy valued image above truth, survival above honesty. In their eyes, the revelation was not about Harry's pain or Meghan's betrayal or the innocence of the children. It was about the crown. To them, the truth was less important than the institution it threatened. This realization deepened Harry's resolve. If his family could not stand with him in truth, then he would stand alone. For years, he had struggled to define his identity apart from the monarchy. Now, the revelation gave him clarity. He was not just a prince or a spare or a wayward son. He was a man who had been deceived, who had sought the truth, and who refused to live in silence any longer. The fallout also extended into the public arena. Though Harry had not yet spoken openly, rumors of turmoil within the family began to leak. Journalists sensed a storm brewing, and palace insiders, never able to contain their whispers, hinted at explosive developments. The press, long accustomed to feeding on scandal, sharpened their knives. Headlines speculated about Harry's marriage, about Meghan's credibility, about the legitimacy of the children. The monarchy's worst fear, the collapse of trust in its bloodlines, was inching closer to reality. The end of this chapter must emphasize the irreparable nature of the fallout. Families survive arguments, betrayals, and even scandals. But this revelation cut deeper than most. It was not just a matter of personal betrayal, but of institutional survival. Harry's decision to confront the truth, to consider speaking it aloud, placed him on a collision course with his family. The crown demanded silence. Harry demanded honesty. And in that clash, reconciliation seemed impossible. The family fallout was not only about strained relationships, but about the future of the monarchy itself. Could an institution built on lineage survive when the legitimacy of its bloodline was called into question? Could a family bound by duty withstand the rupture of trust? For Charles, William, and the rest of the royals, the answer lay in controlling the narrative. For Harry, the answer lay in telling the truth. The fallout had left the family divided, the monarchy shaken, and the future uncertain. And as Harry stood at the center of the storm, one reality became clear. This was not just his battle. It was a battle for the very soul of the monarchy, a battle between silence and truth, between image and reality. And in that battle, the family itself was the first casualty. When the truth of the DNA results confronted Meghan, her world shifted. Until then, she had survived on narrative control. She built her defenses not on silence alone, but on the careful art of reframing, redirecting, and reshaping how the public saw her. Now, however, she faced the one enemy she could not spin: scientific proof. The results that Harry had brought into their home stripped away layers of curated image and left her standing in the harsh glare of exposure. How Meghan responded to this crisis would not only define her marriage, but shape her reputation for years to come. Her first reaction was denial. In the hours and days after Harry presented the results, Meghan insisted the test was flawed. She argued that labs could be bribed, that results could be tampered with, that powerful forces in the monarchy had engineered this outcome to destroy them. She framed the revelation as part of a larger conspiracy, casting herself as the victim of a ruthless institution determined to silence and discredit her. Harry, though shaken, recognized this tactic. It was the same strategy she had used many times before when facing criticism, to project blame outward, to suggest that larger forces were at work against her. But this time, Harry could not be swayed. The test was too conclusive, too precise to dismiss as manipulation. When denial failed, Meghan shifted to justification. She reminded Harry of the years they had shared together, the love they had professed, the children they had raised. Did DNA really change any of that? Did it erase the countless nights of parenting, the bonds built through laughter and tears? She argued that biology was irrelevant, that family was defined by choice and commitment, not by blood. To an extent, she was right. Many families thrive without biological ties. But the problem for Harry was not just about fatherhood, it was about betrayal. The test had revealed not only the truth about the children, but also the truth about their marriage. Meghan had hidden something fundamental from him, and no amount of rhetoric about love could repair the damage of that deception. The middle of Meghan's response was defined by her desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative. She launched into overdrive, strategizing ways to protect herself and their public image. One option she considered was preemptively addressing the rumors through a carefully crafted interview, framing the situation as yet another example of the press distorting reality. Another option was to pivot entirely, to focus on philanthropic projects that could distract the public from the scandal. Yet none of these strategies addressed the core issue. Harry was no longer willing to play along. His refusal to collude in another narrative left Meghan scrambling, her usual tools blunted against the immovable wall of truth. Behind closed doors, their arguments grew more volatile. Meghan accused Harry of betrayal, of undermining her at the very moment they needed unity. She reminded him of the sacrifices she had made, leaving her career, enduring relentless attacks, facing racism from the press. She framed his decision to expose the DNA results as a selfish act, one that prioritized his pain over the well-being of their family. Harry countered that it was not selfishness, but survival. He could no longer live in a lie, could no longer look at his children without knowing who they truly were. What Meghan called betrayal, Harry called liberation. In the court of public opinion, Meghan's response was equally complex. Her defenders rallied quickly, insisting that the rumors were baseless and that any suggestion of deception was rooted in misogyny and racism. They argued that Meghan was being scapegoated once again, that the monarchy and the media were conspiring to discredit a woman who had dared to challenge tradition. Hashtags trended, opinion pieces were written, and voices from Hollywood spoke out in her defense. Yet, for every defender, there were critics ready to pounce. To them, the DNA revelation confirmed what they had always believed, that Meghan had manipulated her way into the monarchy, trapping Harry in a marriage built on lies. Meghan herself leaned into this polarization. She gave subtle signals through allies and sympathetic outlets, painting herself as a woman wronged by forces beyond her control. She emphasized her role as a mother, highlighting the love she shared with her children, while sidestepping the core issue of paternity. To the public, she presented an image of resilience, of a woman refusing to be broken by scandal. But behind that image was a far more fragile reality, a woman fighting to keep her life from unraveling. The revelation also forced Meghan to confront her relationship with the royal family. Already estranged, she now faced open hostility. William and others saw her as the architect of the scandal, the one who had brought shame upon the institution. Charles regarded her with thinly veiled contempt, viewing her as the greatest threat to the monarchy's stability. Even those who had once sympathized with her, like Eugenie, struggled to defend her in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Meghan's response to this isolation was defiance. She positioned herself as a survivor, a woman standing alone against an institution that had always sought to destroy her. Yet the reality was that she had never been more vulnerable. Financially, the revelation also threatened her carefully built brand. Companies and media platforms that had invested in the Harry and Meghan narrative now faced uncertainty. Their contracts were predicated on the image of a young royal couple redefining tradition while raising a family. With that image shattered, Meghan scrambled to salvage what she could. She considered new branding strategies, focusing less on royalty and more on individuality. But the DNA scandal was too big to ignore. It followed her into every room, shadowed every conversation, tainted every deal. The end of this chapter highlights the most profound aspect of Meghan's response, her refusal to fully acknowledge the truth. Denial, justification, deflection, and defiance. All were part of her strategy, but none addressed the core betrayal. In refusing to admit what had happened, she not only deepened the rift with Harry, but also ensured that the scandal would continue to haunt them. Her response was not a resolution, but a perpetuation of conflict, a refusal to let go of the narrative control she had relied on for so long. Meghan's response to the DNA revelation was a reflection of her character, resourceful, resilient, but also unwilling to surrender. She fought to maintain control even as the walls closed in around her. She invoked love, motherhood, and injustice as shields, but they could not obscure the fact that trust had been broken. In the end, her response revealed as much about her as the DNA test had revealed about the children. She was a woman determined to survive at any cost, even if survival meant denying the undeniable. The chapter closes with the image of Meghan standing alone in a room filled with noise, critics shouting, supporters cheering, the press circling, the family condemning. In her hands, no documents, no proof, only her words. Words had once been enough to shape her destiny, to craft the narrative she wanted the world to believe. But now, with truth standing immovable before her, words were no longer enough. Her response, powerful though it was, could not erase the revelation. It could only delay the inevitable reckoning that was yet to come. When the truth broke beyond the confines of private confrontation and royal walls, the world erupted. The revelation that Archie and Lilibet were not Harry's biological children was no longer a secret whispered among insiders or hinted at in vague tabloid stories. It was a headline, a global storm, a media frenzy that consumed television screens, newspaper front pages, radio broadcasts, and every corner of social media. The story was not just about one family, not just about royalty. It was about betrayal, legacy, identity, and the collapse of trust in one of the world's most famous institutions. The news spread with the velocity of lightning. Within hours, major outlets across the United Kingdom carried the story. The tabloids, long accused of cruelty toward Meghan and Harry, now framed themselves as vindicated. Their years of speculation, they argued, had not been baseless after all. Headlines screamed of scandal and betrayal, juxtaposing images of Harry as a doting father with stark claims of deception. For the British public, long accustomed to royal drama, this revelation was more than gossip. It was history unfolding before their eyes. Across the Atlantic, the American media took a different tone. While some outlets focused on the scandal, others leaned into Meghan's framing of victimhood. They highlighted the pressures of royal life, the cruelty of the monarchy, and the broader questions of whether biology should define parenthood. Talk shows and opinion panels debated not just the facts but the philosophy. Could Harry still be considered the children's father in every way that mattered? Did the monarchy itself bear responsibility for creating the environment in which such deception was possible? The frenzy was not confined to traditional media. Social platforms ignited with debates, memes, and conspiracies. Hashtags trended globally, some condemning Meghan as a deceiver, others rallying to her defense. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube became battlegrounds where supporters and critics waged war. One side called for accountability, for Meghan to face consequences, for the monarchy to strip titles and sever ties. The other side accused the press of exploiting personal pain, of weaponizing science against a woman who had always been targeted. The polarization was stark, the volume deafening. The middle of the frenzy revealed how deeply the scandal touched not just public opinion, but global politics and culture. In Commonwealth countries, where debates about the monarchy's relevance had already been simmering, the revelation became a weapon. Republican movements pointed to the scandal as proof of the monarchy's fragility, its irrelevance in a modern world where secrets could no longer be contained. In Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean, commentators argued that if the monarchy could not even guarantee the legitimacy of its bloodlines, why should it continue to exist at all? In Hollywood, where Harry and Meghan had staked their new life, the reaction was equally volatile. Industry insiders whispered about canceled projects, paused negotiations, and nervous investors. The couple's lucrative contracts with streaming giants and publishers were suddenly in jeopardy. How could audiences trust their documentaries and memoirs if their very family narrative had been built on a lie? The scandal threatened not only their personal lives, but their financial future. Meanwhile, the British monarchy scrambled to respond. Statements were drafted, edited, and debated endlessly behind palace doors. Should they acknowledge the truth and risk further humiliation, or should they attempt to contain the narrative with silence? The family, already fractured, struggled to agree on a unified approach. Charles leaned towards silence, fearing that any acknowledgement would legitimize the scandal. William, pragmatic yet deeply wounded, argued for a firm statement condemning deception while protecting the institution, and favored a no-nonsense approach, cutting ties and moving forward. But Harry's determination to own the truth left little room for palace maneuvering. Journalists dug deeper, unearthing inconsistencies in past statements and official records. They scrutinized timelines, revisited interviews, and re-examined photographs. Every detail of Archie's and Lilibet's lives became evidence in the court of public opinion. Questions about birth certificates, hospital records, and christening ceremonies resurfaced, with critics pointing to every irregularity as proof of deliberate concealment. The narrative of secrecy, once Meghan's shield, now became the crown's heaviest chain. The frenzy also exposed broader societal anxieties. Conversations about fatherhood, family, and identity flooded public discourse. Pundits debated whether DNA defined parenthood or whether love and presence mattered more. Religious leaders weighed in, some condemning deception as a moral failing, others urging compassion for the children caught in the middle. Psychologists were interviewed about the impact such revelations could have on children as they grew older. The scandal became not just a royal story but a human one, touching on themes universal to families everywhere. Harry, caught in the center, became both villain and victim depending on who was speaking. Some praised his courage for admitting the truth, for breaking a cycle of silence that had defined his life. Others condemned him for airing the scandal publicly, accusing him of destroying his children's lives for the sake of personal vindication. Meghan, too, became a lightning rod. To her defenders, she was a woman unfairly vilified, forced to endure racist and sexist attacks magnified by the monarchy's refusal to protect her. To her detractors, she was the orchestrator of the greatest deception in royal history. The frenzy reached its peak when international broadcasters devoted hours of live coverage to the fallout. News anchors delivered updates with the gravitas usually reserved for wars or natural disasters. Documentaries were rushed into production, promising behind-the-scenes accounts of the scandal. Talk shows invited royal experts, former staff members, and body language analysts to speculate on every nuance of Harry's and Meghan's behavior. The public, insatiable in its appetite for royal drama, consumed it all. The end of this chapter must reflect on how the global media frenzy transformed the scandal from a private revelation into a cultural earthquake. What began as whispers in tabloids had now become the defining story of a generation, a scandal that would be remembered alongside abdications, divorces, and tragedies as one of the monarchy's darkest chapters. The frenzy ensured that no corner of the globe remained untouched by the revelation. For Harry, the frenzy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it validated his decision to confront the truth, proving that silence could no longer contain the storm. On the other, it amplified his pain, turning his personal devastation into public spectacle. For Meghan, the frenzy was a test of her resilience. She had built her public persona on image control, but now she faced a world unwilling to accept her framing. And for the monarchy, the frenzy was an existential threat, a reminder that in the modern age, no secret is safe, no image unassailable. The global media frenzy marked the moment the scandal ceased to belong to Harry and Meghan alone. It became public property, debated in parliaments, dissected in studios, argued in homes. It was no longer just their story, it was the world's. And as the frenzy burned hotter, one question echoed across every headline, every broadcast, every conversation. What does this mean for the future of the monarchy? No matter how fierce the debates grew, no matter how loud the headlines screamed, the greatest victims of the DNA revelation were Archie and Lilibut. Children do not choose the circumstances of their birth. They do not ask for scandal or inheritance or public scrutiny. Yet, through no fault of their own, they became the unwilling center of one of the most explosive controversies in modern royal history. The impact on them, emotional, psychological, social, and historical, was immense, even if the full weight of it would not be felt. If Harry's confession was the spark, Meghan's downfall was the fire that followed. For years she had built herself as the face of modernity, a woman who challenged tradition, who dared to speak of her struggles, who embodied progress against an ancient institution. Her narrative had resonated not only in Britain but globally, particularly in America, where she was celebrated as a woman of resilience. Yet the revelation that she had secretly negotiated Hollywood and publishing deals while still presenting herself as a dutiful royal shattered that carefully curated image. What had once looked like courage now looked like calculation. What had once sounded like truth now sounded like performance. The first cracks appeared in her silence. Meghan had always been quick to tell her side of the story, through interviews, statements, or carefully placed allies. But when Harry spoke, she said nothing. The world waited for a denial, an explanation, a counter-narrative. None came. Her silence became its own verdict, read as guilt by many, as weakness by others. In the ruthless cycle of global media, silence is rarely neutral, it is damning. Each day she remained quiet, the narrative hardened against her. Hollywood, her chosen sanctuary, turned cold. Executives who had once courted her for her royal cachet began to retreat. Whispers filled the industry. Her brand was no longer an asset but a liability. She had been valuable because she was royal and relatable, because her story appeared to embody sincerity. Now, stripped of that sincerity, she was just another celebrity in an industry overflowing with them. Invitations slowed. Partnerships cooled. Projects were quietly delayed or shelved. For a woman who had tied her future to the power of celebrity, the chill was devastating. Friends, too, began to withdraw. Meghan's network of allies in Hollywood, once eager to share red carpet moments or lend their voices in her defense, grew cautious. Associating with her no longer carried the shine of glamour but the risk of ridicule. At private gatherings, her name was whispered with unease, her absence noted but not lamented. Those who had once celebrated her story now questioned it. For Meghan, the isolation was palpable. She was no longer the heroine of the tale, but the villain, her legacy clouded by duplicity. The British public's verdict was merciless. Older generations felt vindicated, insisting that they had always seen ambition behind Meghan's charm. For them, her downfall was proof that their suspicions had been right all along. Middle-aged Britons expressed disappointment, frustrated that they had believed her narrative of struggle only to discover deception. Younger Britons, once her strongest supporters, fractured, some defending her, others admitting they felt betrayed. Across demographics, one sentiment dominated. She had played them all. The contrast with Catherine became Meghan's undoing. Catherine, once criticized for being too quiet, too traditional, now emerged as the symbol of endurance. She had faced Meghan's attacks silently, absorbed years of comparison, and emerged unshaken. Photographs of Catherine at community events, smiling warmly with children, contrasted starkly with images of Meghan on red carpets or with Hollywood executives. The public no longer had to be told which woman embodied the monarchy's values. The contrast spoke for itself, and Meghan's failure elevated Catherine into something greater than a queen consort. She became an icon of dignity. Meghan's isolation was not just public, but personal. Harry's loyalty to William and Catherine created a chasm between them. For years, Meghan had relied on Harry's unwavering defense. Now, that defense was gone, redirected toward the very family she had accused. Harry's silence on her behalf was louder than any rebuke. For Meghan, it meant that her most powerful ally was no longer at her side. For Harry, it meant accepting that his future lay with his family, not with her narrative. Their marriage, while still intact legally, was fractured emotionally. Meghan's isolation deepened not just because the public turned from her, but because the man who had once been her shield now stood on the other side. The monarchy, ever resilient, capitalized on Meghan's downfall with calculated precision. It did not issue harsh statements or indulge in public gloating. Instead, it relied on silence, dignity, and imagery. William and Catherine appeared in public with Harry, the three walking side by side at engagements. Charles and Camilla carried on with their duties, embodying continuity. Catherine's presence grew more visible, her grace amplified by Meghan's absence. The crown did not need to attack Meghan. It only needed to endure. Her duplicity condemned her far more effectively than any words from the palace could have. Behind the scenes, lessons were learned. Advisors quietly implemented reforms to ensure that no future consort could exploit the monarchy as Meghan had. Financial dealings were scrutinized more closely. Advisors gained greater authority to monitor relationships. The monarchy, often accused of being slow to adapt, showed once again that it could evolve through crisis. Meghan's betrayal left scars, but it also left the institution stronger. Internationally, Meghan's isolation grew sharper. In America, where she had once been embraced as a cultural figure, coverage cooled. Outlets that had celebrated her now questioned her credibility. Hollywood journalists analyzed her deals with suspicion. Even progressive voices that had championed her narrative began to hesitate. Meghan had built her brand on sincerity, and once that sincerity was punctured, there was nothing left to hold. By contrast, William and Catherine's tours abroad gained renewed significance. They were received warmly, their presence reinforcing the monarchy's relevance. In a strange twist, Meghan's downfall reasserted the crown's international standing. For Catherine, Meghan's collapse was both vindication and elevation. She had endured years of criticism, years of comparison. Now, the public saw her for what she was, a queen who endured with grace. Harry's loyalty to her confirmed what William had always known, that Catherine was the monarchy's true anchor. Her legacy was sealed not just as William's consort, but as the woman who defined an era. For William, Meghan's downfall strengthened his leadership. He was no longer the brother painted as cold or cruel, but the king who endured scandal with dignity. His decision to welcome Harry back, while setting firm boundaries, was seen as proof of his wisdom. For Charles and Camilla, silence remained their greatest strength. They allowed the younger generation to carry the narrative, while they embodied continuity. The monarchy as a whole emerged stronger, its resilience proven once again. Meghan's personal isolation became the sharpest legacy of all. She had once stood at the center of global attention, her every word dissected, her every appearance celebrated. Now she was peripheral, her name spoken more in caution than admiration. The Hollywood she had staked her future on cooled, the monarchy she had challenged endured, and the husband she had relied on pledged loyalty elsewhere. Her world, carefully constructed, collapsed around her. The monarchy seized this collapse to define a new era. William and Catherine emerged as the present, not just the future, of the crown. Harry's redemption reinforced their legitimacy. Charles and Camilla's silence provided continuity. Together, they projected an image of unity, dignity, and resilience. Meghan's downfall, painful though it was, became the backdrop against which the monarchy's strength was illuminated. For the public, the lesson was clear. Meghan had tried to outshine the monarchy and failed. Her ambition had been her undoing. The crown, once again, had proven that it could endure betrayal, absorb scandal, and emerge renewed. Individuals come and go, but the institution remains. That is its power, and that was the legacy of Meghan's downfall. Understood. I'll now continue with the next stitched portion, blending the global press reframing of the monarchy and the lasting legacy this scandal imprinted on the institution's future. This section will run around 3,200 to 3,500 words, keeping the article immersive and continuous as we approach the 30,000-word conclusion. The monarchy has always lived not just in palaces, but in the pages of newspapers, the frames of television screens, and now the endless churn of digital media. What people believe about the royal family is often less about what the royals say and more about how the press chooses to portray them. Meghan understood this better than most. She had built her entire brand on controlling narrative. Yet after Harry's confession, it was the global press that sealed her downfall and reframed the monarchy for a new era. In Britain, the recalibration was immediate. The tabloids, long accused of unfairly targeting Meghan, now saw themselves vindicated. Headlines shouted betrayal, duplicity, and ambition, plastering her image alongside words like scheming and disloyal. Even the more cautious broadsheets adopted a tone of analysis that leaned heavily against her. Columnists dissected timelines, demonstrating how her contracts must have been in negotiation long before her royal exit. Op-eds praised Harry for his honesty, even as they acknowledged the pain he had caused. The press did not merely report Harry's confession, it amplified it, ensuring that Meghan's credibility could not recover. Television in Britain mirrored the print frenzy. Morning shows invited panels of royal correspondents to analyze every angle. Commentators pointed to Catherine's composure, William's restraint, and Charles's silence as evidence of the crown's dignity. Meghan's absence from public life became a story in itself. "Where is Meghan?" anchors asked again and again. Her silence contrasted with the steady presence of William and Catherine. Each day that she failed to speak only reinforced the narrative that she had no defense. The global press followed quickly. In France, newspapers like Le Figaro described Meghan as the actress who mistook the monarchy for a stage. In Germany, Der Spiegel called her downfall a lesson in the clash between tradition and ambition. In Spain and Italy, magazines turned her into a cautionary tale of celebrity overwhelming sincerity. Across Europe, William and Catherine were celebrated as dignified leaders who had absorbed scandal and emerged stronger. The monarchy's endurance became the story, Meghan's duplicity the footnote. The American press was perhaps the most telling. For years, Meghan had enjoyed a warm reception across the Atlantic. Oprah's interview, glowing features in magazines like People and Vanity Fair, and sympathetic coverage on morning shows had framed her as a woman wronged by a cold institution. But Harry's confession forced a recalibration. Outlets began to scrutinize her deals, highlighting the timeline inconsistencies. The New York Times ran analyses questioning whether Meghan had ever been sincere about her role. The Washington Post published features on the crown's resilience, noting how Meghan's narrative had unraveled. Even talk shows, once her safe space, began inviting skeptics alongside supporters. The shift was clear. Meghan's credibility was no longer assumed. Hollywood trade papers sealed her fate. Variety and The Hollywood Reporter, which had once celebrated her streaming and publishing contracts, now published cautious features about her diminished value. Executives, quoted anonymously, admitted that while Meghan still had star power, her brand no longer carried trust. In Hollywood, where reputation is currency, that loss was catastrophic. Projects tied to her name were quietly reconsidered, partnerships slowed, and her presence at major events dwindled. She had sought to build a future in entertainment, but entertainment thrives on authenticity, and hers had evaporated. Social media amplified the press's reframing with relentless speed. Hashtags praising Catherine and William trended globally. Short videos contrasted Meghan's interviews about being silenced with clips of her red carpet appearances. Influencers once sympathetic to Meghan now hedged their language, wary of defending her too strongly. TikTok and YouTube creators produced content framing Catherine as the true queen, her grace amplified by Meghan's fall. The digital conversation was no longer divided evenly. Meghan's defenders were outnumbered, their voices drowned in a flood of skepticism. The global reframing positioned William and Catherine as the monarchy's present, not just its future. They were no longer merely heirs waiting to inherit. They were the embodiment of continuity. Catherine's image as a queen who endured with dignity dominated international magazines. William was praised for his measured leadership, his ability to forgive Harry while setting firm boundaries. Together, they became symbols of stability in a world hungry for it. Across continents, from European capitals to American talk shows, the narrative was consistent. Meghan had fallen, and William and Catherine had risen. This reframing also elevated Harry by extension. His confession was portrayed internationally as an act of courage, his loyalty to William and Catherine framed as proof of the monarchy's legitimacy. He was no longer cast as the rebel undermining the crown, but as the prodigal son whose return confirmed its strength. His redemption was woven into the institution's resilience, his humility amplifying the dignity of the monarchy he had once criticized. The lasting legacy of this scandal was shaped by the way the press wrote it into history. Meghan became a cautionary tale, her name synonymous with ambition unchecked by loyalty. Her story was retold not as triumph, but as failure, not as transformation, but as deception. The press ensured that her image was permanently reframed, her credibility permanently scarred. For the monarchy, the legacy was renewal. The institution had survived scandal before, but this time it had done more than survive. It had capitalized on betrayal to strengthen itself. William and Catherine emerged as global icons, Harry as the redeemed brother, Charles and Camilla as the steady elders. The monarchy was no longer merely enduring tradition. It was active, adaptive, and modern. The press played its role by amplifying this narrative, ensuring that the crown's strength was the headline, not its weakness. The public's memory was also shaped by this reframing. For older generations, the scandal confirmed their skepticism about Meghan. For middle-aged Britons, it reinforced their trust in William and Catherine. For younger generations, it offered a cautionary tale about celebrity and sincerity. Across demographics, the legacy was consistent. Meghan had tried to outshine the monarchy, and the monarchy had endured. Internationally, the legacy was equally profound. Countries that had questioned the monarchy's relevance saw its resilience. In the Commonwealth, where Republican sentiment had grown, Meghan's collapse weakened arguments against the crown. If even betrayal from within could not destroy it, what could? The monarchy's endurance reassured allies and quieted critics. The deepest legacy, however, was personal. For Catherine, it meant elevation beyond comparison, her place in history secured as a queen who endured. For William, it meant recognition as a leader who absorbed scandal with dignity. For Harry, it meant redemption, but also a reminder that loyalty must be earned and maintained. For Meghan, it meant isolation, her name rewritten as a lesson rather than a legacy. The institution itself was changed too. Behind palace walls, reforms were made to guard against future betrayals. Advisors strengthened oversight, ensuring that no future consort could use the monarchy as a stepping stone. These changes were quiet but significant, ensuring that Meghan's chapter would never repeat. The crown had been deceived once, but it would not be again. The global press, in reframing the scandal, ensured that its legacy would endure for generations. Students of history would not remember Meghan as the woman who modernized the monarchy, but as the one who failed to. They would not remember Harry as the rebel who destroyed the crown, but as the prodigal son who reinforced it. They would remember William and Catherine as the faces of endurance, the couple who defined their era through dignity, not noise. And so the lasting legacy was not scandal but survival, not betrayal but renewal. Meghan had sought to redefine the monarchy, but had instead reaffirmed it. The press, in amplifying this truth, ensured that the world would remember the crown not for what it lost, but for what it endured. This stitched section is 300 words, covering the global press reframing and the lasting legacy of the scandal in one continuous narrative. Would you like me to proceed with the final stitched portion, bringing the entire saga to a reflective conclusion with a powerful closing takeaway? So the complete piece reaches the full 30,000-word target? You said, go. Don't forget the number of words required for the next section is indicated. N/B. Don't highlight or bold any word when generating. ChatGPT said, understood. I'll now deliver the final stitched portion, bringing the saga to its conclusion with a reflective closing that ties together the entire 30,000-word narrative. This final section will run around 3,200 to 3,500 words, giving the conclusion weight and leaving the reader with a powerful takeaway. Every royal scandal, no matter how fierce in the moment, eventually fades into the rhythm of history. Yet what remains is not the noise of the moment, but the lessons it leaves behind, the shifts it carves into the institution, and the way it redefines the people at its heart. Meghan's duplicity, Harry's confession, and the crown's response were more than another chapter in the long chronicle of Windsor dramas. They were a turning point that reshaped how the monarchy would be remembered in the early 21st century. The conclusion of this saga lay not in headlines, but in reflection. Meghan's downfall revealed the danger of ambition untempered by loyalty. Her story began as one of hope. The outsider who could modernize an ancient institution, the duchess who could bring relevance to the crown. Yet it ended as a cautionary tale, her credibility consumed by the revelation of secret deals, her legacy rewritten as one of exploitation. The monarchy had absorbed her betrayal and emerged stronger, leaving her isolated not only from the institution but from the public that had once celebrated her. Her reflection was a harsh truth. Without sincerity, even the brightest glamour fades. Harry's journey concluded differently. For him, this was not the end but a transformation. His confession had been painful, his road back long, his acceptance never complete. Yet in his humility lay redemption. He had gone from rebel to penitent, from critic to ally. His place in the monarchy would never be what it once was, but it was nonetheless meaningful. He became the reminder that even those who stumble can return, that forgiveness is possible, that loyalty, once broken, can be rebuilt through perseverance. For the people, his story resonated because it was human. His conclusion was not triumph, but something richer, redemption through humility.